A joke that lands too easily and too quickly is rarely just a joke, and this one never was. When a Gen X man mocks the thing he loves most, the mockery is not contempt, it is proximity disguised as distance. Something in that timing has never been accidental, no matter how quick or careless it appears on the surface. The sharper the sarcasm, the closer it sits to something he has never learned to say without flinching first. I notice this pattern long before I am able to name it with any real precision. He deflects a compliment with a joke about the weather or the traffic or something unrelated to the moment that just passed between you. He does this every time affection threatens to surface without a shield already standing in front of it. You start to recognize the rhythm before you recognize its actual meaning, because the rhythm repeats with a precision that feels almost engineered rather than accidental. A softness appears in his voice for a fraction of a second, and within seconds it gets covered by something drier and quicker to say aloud. This covering happens so reliably across so many different situations that it stops looking like a conscious choice at all. It begins to resemble a reflex that fires before thought has any real chance to intervene. You begin to wonder whether the joke is protecting the affection underneath it or quietly replacing that affection altogether. That uncertainty is the first thing in this pattern that refuses to resolve itself, no matter how long you watch it unfold. Even the timing of the joke carries information, since it almost always arrives at the exact threshold where something sincere might otherwise have been said aloud. I notice that the humor never lands a beat too early, as if some internal mechanism is monitoring the moment for the precise instant sincerity becomes risky. This precision suggests the behavior is not careless at all, even though it is designed to look effortless from the outside. The sarcasm rarely shifts in tone whether he speaks to a friend, a father, or a wife of 30 years. This consistency is itself worth noticing, because most behavior adjusts depending on who is standing in front of it. I watch him deploy the same dry deflection at a funeral as he does at a backyard barbecue, adjusted only slightly for volume and audience. He treats vulnerability the way some people treat spilled liquid, something to be wiped away quickly before it stains whatever surface it landed on. You notice that the other men in the room laugh at these moments in a way that feels closer to recognition than actual amusement. It is as if each of them has built an identical shield out of nearly identical material, without ever once comparing notes on how it was built. Nobody in the room seems surprised by any of this, and that absence of surprise says more than the joke itself ever could say directly. A room full of men who all recognize the same deflection has already told you something structural is happening underneath it. This is not simply personal restraint, because restraint shaped this precisely rarely comes from one household working entirely alone. I trace the pattern backward, and it widens almost immediately into something structural rather than something purely individual. The economy these men entered as young adults offered fewer guarantees than the one their fathers had once been promised at the same age. Stability had to be built through self-reliance rather than through any inherited expectation of institutional or employer support. Technology arrived during their adolescence as something optional rather than constant, and this small fact mattered more than it first appears to. Emotional expression still had to travel almost entirely through face-to-face proximity, where any exposure carried an immediate and visible social cost among peers. Labor during their formative years rewarded stoicism openly and consistently, since a man who did not complain was assumed to be more dependable than one who did.
Complaint itself, however minor, was quietly read as a form of unreliability that could follow a young man for years. Emotional culture around them treated open sincerity as a kind of currency that could be spent carelessly and cheaply if handled wrong. Carelessness of that kind was punished quickly, usually through mockery delivered by peers who had already learned the same lesson earlier themselves. Social responsibility fell onto many of their shoulders early, often through fractured households, working parents, or a father who was simply absent. Responsibility inherited that early in life rarely leaves much room for a rehearsed or comfortable kind of tenderness later on. Each of these conditions did not operate alone, and none of them by itself fully explains the pattern that follows. I notice how these conditions reinforced one another rather than simply accumulating side by side. An economy demanding self-reliance made emotional dependence look like a liability rather than a normal human need. A culture that punished sincerity with mockery made self-reliance feel safer to perform than vulnerability ever could. You start to see how each condition quietly strengthens the others, producing something more durable than any single cause could have built alone. What becomes clear is that no single mechanism produced this behavior on its own because too many pressures converged on one generation at roughly the same time. There are multiple layers of adaptation running underneath what looks on the surface like a simple habit of joking around. What is being described here is not one habit, but an entire structure, and that structure appears to operate across at least 7 distinct psychological levels. 7 layers sit beneath this pattern, and each one exists to explain what the layer above it could not fully account for on its own. 7 layers can be named directly here: observable behavior, habitual patterning, identity, responsibility, relationships, meaning, and the collective psychological blind spot. Each layer answers a question left open by the layer before it, while simultaneously creating a new limit that forces the analysis further downward. The descent begins, as it should, with whatever can actually be seen from the outside first. What can be seen first is the surface, because the surface is where every version of this pattern begins to show itself openly. He responds to a moment of closeness with a single line of humor that redirects attention away from the feeling that just appeared. The redirection is almost always instant, arriving before the moment has had any chance to settle into stillness. You have watched him do this often enough that you no longer register it as deflection, only as a fixed part of his personality. The pattern repeats across contexts that share nothing in common except the presence of unguarded emotion sitting nearby. What keeps this exact behavior showing up with such consistency across so many unrelated situations remains, for now, unclear. I notice that the behavior does not weaken even in private, where an audience is not present to judge the response. This suggests the pattern is not primarily social performance, even though it looks that way from the outside. The mechanism underneath the surface is a learned substitution, where humor was trained early to stand in for direct disclosure whenever disclosure felt unsafe to attempt. I see this substitution functioning as an adaptation rather than as any kind of personal flaw or character failure. He likely learned, without any formal instruction, that a joke could carry warmth while still leaving an exit route available if that warmth went unreturned. The exit route matters more than the joke itself because it protects him from a specific kind of exposed silence. You start to notice that his sarcasm intensifies specifically at the moments when sincerity would be most expected of him, not least expected. A mechanism like this only survives if it keeps being rewarded somewhere along the way. That question of ongoing reward raises another one about what happens once the reward itself becomes fully automatic and unconscious. I notice that the reward rarely comes from the other person directly, since most partners do not reinforce the joke on purpose. Instead, the reward seems internal, arriving simply from having avoided the discomfort of unguarded exposure one more time. Repetition of this exact exchange over years slowly turns a coping strategy into something closer to a reflex than an active decision. I watch him arrive at the joke before any alternative response has even had time to form in the moment. He no longer appears to be avoiding sincerity in any deliberate sense, because avoidance would still imply an option he is actively choosing to reject. The absence of deliberation is exactly what makes this stage difficult to separate from simple personality. You recognize that what once protected him now simply defines him, and the line between protection and identity has quietly disappeared over time. Once a reaction becomes this automatic, something about the original capacity underneath it tends to begin fading away slowly. I notice that this fading rarely announces itself with any single dramatic moments that would make it noticeable. It happens instead across thousands of small exchanges, each one slightly reinforcing the same groove a little deeper than before. What fades first is his fluency in direct emotional language, the exact muscle that would once have let plain affection be spoken without a joke wrapped around it. I notice that he can describe how a failing car engine sounds in precise technical detail, yet stumble over 3 plain words meant for someone he loves deeply. The gap between those two abilities is not incidental, and it says something about which kinds of language were ever practiced. He carries this absence inside completely ordinary behavior, so it never announces itself as any kind of visible loss to the people watching. You realize that something which might once have come naturally to him has quietly disappeared across decades of repeated substitution and avoidance. That disappearance does not stay contained to him alone, because an entire cohort of men appears to manage an almost identical private negotiation. I notice that the fear rarely surfaces as fear itself, since it is almost always disguised as simple preference or personal style. He would likely describe himself as private rather than afraid, and that description is not entirely false, only incomplete. The negotiation extends outward into something fully collective, a shared blind spot where an entire generation of men mistake restraint for strength. I watch partners and children absorb this ceiling as a permanent condition of the relationship, rather than as something shaped by circumstance or choice. They rarely question it directly, because questioning it would require the same directness the ceiling was built to prevent. This is not the final layer of the pattern, because a limit inside one relationship always points outward toward a wider structure still waiting to be properly named. I notice that the ceiling itself rarely gets discussed, even in relationships that are otherwise close and communicative. It simply gets absorbed as an unspoken condition, quietly built into the architecture of daily life together. Relationships built around this exact ceiling develop their own quiet accommodations over time, ones nobody explicitly agrees to, but everyone somehow learns. The people around him learn to translate sarcasm back into sincerity without ever asking him to change how he actually speaks. I watch a wife interpret a joke about her cooking as a private statement about how much he depends on the routine she built for them both. A son learns to hear teasing about his choices as evidence of attention rather than as evidence of disappointment or disillusionment from his father. You notice that this decoding work has become a skill practiced almost entirely by the people who love him, rarely practiced by him directly. That imbalance in translation labor raises a further question about what exactly all of this is protecting him from feeling. What it protects against is a deeper exposure tied to meaning itself, not simply to the emotion sitting on the surface. There is a private fear here that plain sincerity might reveal more dependency than he believes a man is permitted to show openly. I see the joke functioning as a barrier not against the emotion itself, but against whatever that emotion might imply about his own adequacy as a partner or father. He treats need as something categorically separate from love, as though acknowledging one would somehow diminish or cheapen the other. You start to see that the humor was never really about the moment at hand. It was always about controlling what that moment was allowed to mean. This question of meaning does not stay confined to one man alone, because an entire cohort of men appears to manage an almost identical private negotiation. I noticed that the fear rarely surfaces as fear itself, since it is almost always disguised as simple preference or personal style. He would likely describe himself as private rather than afraid, and that description is not entirely false, only incomplete. The negotiation extends outward into something fully collective, a shared blind spot where an entire generation of men mistake restraint for strength. They rarely examine the actual difference between the two, because examining it would already require the sincerity the pattern was built to avoid. I notice how rarely this pattern gets named openly among them, since naming it directly would demand exactly what the pattern exists to prevent. He remains unaware that thousands of men his age are running an almost identical translation process inside nearly identical households. You begin to understand that what once felt like a personal quirk was in fact a shared adaptation distributed quietly across an entire cohort. None of them ever compared notes, and yet the pattern arrived in nearly the same shape in household after household. This is where the descent through the 7 layers stops, not because the analysis has run out of material to examine. It stops because there is no further floor beneath a pattern shared this widely and this quietly across so many lives. I notice that this shared blind spot rarely gets corrected by any one relationship alone, since correction would require an entire cohort to recognize itself simultaneously. That kind of simultaneous recognition is rare precisely because the pattern was built to prevent exactly this sort of open naming. None of these 7 layers ever operated separately from any of the others throughout this entire account. The joke on the surface was never simply a joke because it already carried the residue of everything beneath it. It carried a mechanism, an accumulation, a hidden cost, a relational boundary, a private fear about meaning, and a blind spot shared by millions of men. None of those men ever discussed any of this openly with one another, and yet each one built the same structure independently. Each layer fed directly into the one above it while depending entirely on the one sitting beneath it for its own existence. Together, they form a structure that resists reduction to any single tidy explanation offered in isolation. What looked at first glance like a simple personality trait turns out instead to be a compressed history of adaptation. That history keeps operating in real time. Every single moment, affection needs somewhere safe to hide inside it. I notice that even naming these 7 layers explicitly does not dissolve the pattern itself, since naming and unlearning are entirely different processes. A structure built across decades of repetition does not loosen simply because it has finally been described from the outside. It continues to run quietly beneath conscious awareness, even in the exact moment someone points directly at it. There is no conclusion being offered here, only a final observation that stays without ever fully resolving itself. He remains, in this account, only a psychological pattern rather than any one specific individual person. What once felt like one man's odd personal habit is, in fact, a fragment of something far more structural. It is a fragment distributed across an entire generation that learned the same silence at roughly the same time in history. The inquiry stops precisely at that point of recognition without moving forward into any comfortable resolution or answer. I notice that recognition itself carries a particular weight, distinct from whatever emotional relief a resolution might have offered instead. Seeing the structure clearly does not repair it, and it was never the purpose of this observation to attempt repair. What remains is simply a clearer picture of something that was always operating, whether or not anyone had ever looked directly at it before. A different pattern of psychological behavior remains unexplained, sitting just beyond everything covered in this particular investigation. He, inside that separate pattern, has not yet been fully understood, and this inquiry has not reached him yet. You are invited to keep observing, not in order to arrive at some final answer, but simply to continue. The continuation matters more here than any conclusion, because the analysis was never designed to end cleanly. It is only meant to extend into territory that has not yet been properly named or mapped. Thank you for staying through this entire psychological investigation without looking away partway through its 7 layers. If one of these layers felt closer to something inside your own life than the others did, that recognition is worth naming somewhere below. Following this channel and turning on notifications means the next investigation reaches you the moment it quietly begins. It arrives carried in the same observing analytical tone that has run through everything said here from the very first sentence without ever once breaking away from it. The inquiry does not end so much as it pauses, waiting patiently for the next pattern that has not yet been given a name.